Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I have a jam-packed episode for you here today. We're going to go over all of the moves the Vikings have made in free agency, of which there are many. We'll go over some of the guys that left, where the Vikings are at in terms of a comp pick situation, all that. I'm going to break down, kind of what I think of each individual signings, although I haven't watched any of the guys that the Vikings added yet. So, it's not going to be necessarily an in-depth breakdown on their games. I'll just go over kind of initial impressions of what I think of them as players and kind of that sort of thing, right? So, if we jump right into it, I think, the first thing I want to look at to set the stage is just the departures from the Vikings, right? So the first one out the door, obviously the biggest one, is Sam Darnold, who went to the Seahawks. 3 years, $100.5 million was the reporting. A Florida report came out yesterday that he actually only has $37.5 million fully guaranteed, but there's $55 million in total guarantees on that contract, and the average is $33.5 million. But the Seahawks can still get it out of it after 1 year for just $37 million, right? So it's not the strongest contract in the world for Sam Darnold. In fact, it's a pretty weak contract, although still getting $37 million in cash year one. And as well as a salary, which is kind of weird too. There's no signing bonus to the deal, but regardless, a strong payday for Darnold, certainly not what I was willing to go up to for the Vikings, even if it is only 1 year of guarantees, right? I certainly wouldn't have given him multiple years of guarantees. But even with just 1 year of guarantees, the $37 million cap hit this year would be pretty restrictive to the Vikings doing what they did in free agency and adding so many players and signing so many large contracts. So I think it makes total sense for them not to be in on that type of move. And also the contract kind of reveals why it didn't make sense for the Vikings to try to tag and trade Darnold, because he would have been owed $41 million guaranteed on the franchise tag. That's more money than he was able to get becoming an unrestricted free agent, right? It kind of tells you that other teams weren't really all that into Sam Darnold in general, and they weren't even willing to pay him the total for the franchise tag in terms of guaranteed money. So I don't think the Vikings really would have been able to get anything in return for him had they franchised him. And given that, it made sense that they didn't, and they let him walk, and they've kind of positioned themselves to get a third round compensatory pick, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which will be 97 overall next year. Certainly, just based on the Darnold contract, better than what they would have gotten if Darnold had, if they had tagged him, right? So I think the Vikings were very vindicated in not franchise tagging Sam Darnold, and I think that they're even more vindicated after even based on the initial reporting, right? He only gets $33.5 million a year. It's really hard to only pay a guy $33.5 million a year when you're on the hook for $40 million in year one, right? But even after that, with the reporting that the guarantee is less than we initially thought it was, is really, really indicative that Darnold would not have had the market. So Vikings, I think, very vindicated in terms of that decision to not franchise tag Sam Darnold. The next big free agent signing that left was Cam Bynum, who got 4 years, $60 million. And I put these numbers together like a couple days ago. I'm recording this on Monday evening, the week after free agency started. So there may be some odds and ends that aren't exactly correct, but the reporting I saw said Cam Bynum was 4 years, $60 million with $30 million guaranteed. That's $15 million a year. And obviously, if $30 million are guaranteed, there's an out after 2 years of the contract. Pretty typical for a near top of the market, contract for a player at any position to be able to get out of it after 2 years. For a younger player like Bynum, it makes sense that he gets the 2 years fully guaranteed. I'll go into it with the Vikings contracts a little bit, but they have a pretty easy time getting out of most of them after 1 year, unless the player is like 27. Right. So for Bynum, I think, this is a good amount of money for him. I think he's a high quality starting safety who can be, a half field kind of player, I guess I want to say. But at the end of the day, I think he was a really good player for the Vikings for a long time. I'm a little bit sad that they weren't able to retain him, but, just based on the reporting I saw from like Alec Lewis, who at the Athletic, who, by the way, like nailed basically every one of his predictions in his pre-free agency. So I would say he was quite plugged in terms of the value, and also the Access Vikings beat, which is Emily Lykier. I don't actually know how to say Emily's last name, unfortunately. And Ben Gessling and Andrew Kramer. Or, those people I would say were the most trustworthy in terms of Vikings reporting in this cycle. So if you want to like listen to people who are plugged in and have great information, like almost all of the contract details I got from the Vikings came from Ben Gessling tweeting them, right? Because he got them from the agent or whatever. But those people are the people who are plugged into the Minnesota Vikings. I don't think I would listen to the national reporters, and I'm probably going to get into this a little bit in terms of what they think the Vikings are likely to do, because they are literally just team and or agent mouthpieces, which, not saying that, local Vikings reporters don't get information from agents or don't get information and have a little bit of mouthpiece from team sources, but they don't push the narrative the way the guys on NFL Network or ESPN or at The Athletic do, right? Or the national reporting at The Athletic, let me say. But Cam Bynum, I thought, very strong deal for him, very much deserves it, was one of the top safeties on the market and got paid like it. He got paid the same amount as, I think, Javon Holland, got paid a little less than Trayvon Merrick, but, in the same ballpark of a lot of the highest paid safeties in this free agency cycle. So really happy for him to be able to do that, and sad he's not going to be on the Vikings anymore. But like I said, they kind of signed the contract. They kind of signed Theo Jackson to, told me they were looking at Theo Jackson as a potential starter, right? And that only leaves one starting safety spot for Harrison Smith or Cam Bynum, and Harrison Smith decided to come back. So the Vikings probably read the winds, knew Smith was coming back, really wanted to have him back and have him in that role. So they decided to keep him over Cam Bynum. The next player that left, and I just sorted these by the total contract value, was Daniel Jones going to the Colts. He got 1 year, $14 million. $13.15 million were fully guaranteed. The other non-guarantees were like per game roster bonuses and that sort of thing. And it's a $14 million a year average. Obviously, the Colts have indicated that they want Jones to compete with Anthony Richardson to be the starting quarterback there. It's kind of hard for the Vikings to beat that offer, right? Because it's pretty obvious that the Vikings want JJ McCarthy to be their long-term starter. So it would be a much more symbolic competition if he joined the Vikings, at least the way the Colts are posturing. I also think that $14 million basically fully guaranteed, $13 million fully guaranteed was a bit rich for the Vikings in terms of this market, right? That's a lot of money to pay your backup quarterback. So I can definitely see them bowing out at like the $10 million range, which is what they were willing to pay Sam Darnold last year, and just letting the Colts have at it. I don't feel particularly bad about that from a negotiation standpoint, right? Because it counts towards the compensatory formula. And again, I'm going to get into the compensatory formula and all the cancellations and where we're at right now. But the top four players I'm talking about here count towards it. And right now, the Vikings are slated to get the 97th overall pick, and Daniel Jones's contract is part of the reason that that's the case. So really, for Daniel Jones, for getting paid basically nothing to be on the Vikings practice squad and then spending like 1 week on the roster, right? Like one playoff game on the active roster, the Vikings get the 97th overall pick because of that, in part. So it was really shrewd maneuvering by the Vikings, and really a credit to Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings staff's reputation that they were able to bring in Daniel Jones in the first place and kind of get this really nice benefit for him. The next player that got signed, right, and the last that passes the comp pick threshold for right now, is Patrick Jones, who got signed by the Panthers. 2 years, $15 million. I saw the original reporting was $20 million, but I guess that went down. And that's $7.5 million per year. I don't know what the guarantees on that deal are. I doubt they're like super strong, but they should certainly be good enough to keep him with the Panthers for 1 year and get the Vikings that comp pick or have him count towards the compensatory formula, right? And, I think we all kind of knew that Patrick Jones was going to be leaving the Vikings after this season as a third rotational rusher. He was very productive this last year, and I thought he played relatively well, like up to the standard of what you'd want a third pass rusher to play as. And I thought he was better than what DJ Wanham had showed, right, over the course of his time with the Vikings. Like he'd improved significantly from his rookie year and was actually a pretty quality rotational player, in my opinion. So it's not a surprise to me that he got this kind of deal. But also, it's kind of a situation where the Vikings just kind of crowded him out of the room, right? They have Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Grenard, who both made the Pro Bowl last year. You're not going to want to take them off the field for snaps for Pat Jones necessarily. And obviously they have Dallas Turner as their third player. So really you'd be paying Pat Jones to be what you would think is your fourth edge rusher, and $7.5 million a year is just too rich for that. So good for him that he was able to get that money elsewhere. And the final three players, kind of smaller contracts. Trent Sherfield got a 2-year, $6 million contract for the Broncos, $1.5 million guaranteed, $3 million a year. That's a little bit richer than what I projected. I think I had him at like $2.5 million or something like that for 1 year when I brought him back to the Vikings in my mock free agency. So it's a pretty strong deal for Sherfield, and I don't know if the Vikings were willing. Obviously the Vikings weren't willing to match it, but it's not a bad, like it's something they could have done, but there's not like an amazing benefit to that. Right. So he's a bottom of the roster player. Those kind of turn over, and he was able to get more money elsewhere. So I don't feel too bad about losing him either. Just like Johnny Munt, who went to the Jaguars for 2 years, $5.5 million. That's with $2.25 million guaranteed. So that's basically half of it, although not quite. He has $2.75 million per year on that deal. That's higher than I would have been willing to pay for Johnny Munt. Now, the Vikings obviously need to figure out their third tight end situation after that happened. But, Johnny Munt's like an okay player who I don't really want to see the field, right? Like I consistently joke that you should find somebody who loves you as much as Kevin O'Connell loves Johnny Munt. Well, maybe it was Grant Udinski who loved Johnny Munt that much, right? Going to the Jaguars, or like Liam Cohen, who probably worked with him back in Los Angeles. I don't know. Liam Cohen jumped around a lot, so I don't know if his years in LA coincided with Munt. But the Jags kind of get a guy who is a fine third tight end. He's not somebody who I think rises to the level of the second tight end, which is why I don't really need to pay him, $2.5 million or whatever it is a year to play for us. So it's whatever. The Vikings definitely need to find somebody for that position to rotate in snaps, but I bet the player also won't rotate in snaps as much, right? And we can probably use CJ Ham in some of those situations anyway. So the final player that left, and given the other two quarterbacks leaving, I think this one hurts a little bit more, was Nick Mullins, who went to the Jaguars, 2 years, $4.5 million with $3 million guaranteed, right? So that's a pretty significant chunk of that, signing is guaranteed, and $2.25 million per year. This is one that in retrospect, I think the Vikings wish they would have done. They don't have a good backup quarterback option. There aren't a ton of viable backup quarterback options on the market, especially ones that don't cost compensatory picks. The amount of money that backup quarterbacks get is, even the bad ones, right, are going to get on the fringe of compensatory pick range. Like Marcus Mariota got $8 million, right? And I don't necessarily want Marcus Mariota to be in a position to start for my team, but that's just kind of the going rate of a backup quarterback. So, Mullins is a fun, high variance player. It's not like I necessarily want to see him on the field, but I'd rather have somebody in the room who I think can be interesting than have Brett Rippon as my second quarterback, right? So I think the Vikings will still need to add to that quarterback room. And unfortunately they were outbid by the Jags on Mullins, and that kind of happened right as free agency opened and Daniel Jones was still making a decision, right? Like the Vikings knew Sam Darnold was going to be gone, but they were still in a little bit of a bidding war with the Colts, and Daniel Jones hadn't made his final decision, which meant Nick Mullins made his decision before Daniel Jones did and left the Vikings kind of high and dry, right? Because they would have preferred to have Jones as a backup over Mullins, obviously, is what that tells me. And I think that's obvious to anybody who like thinks about it for more than a second and thinks about it for more than a couple fun Nick Mullins plays. Daniel Jones is, while not a great starting quarterback or anybody who I've had a ton of faith in being, a long-term solution for a franchise, he has the mobility and has kind of the chops of a starting quarterback that Nick Mullins does not really have. So I think Daniel Jones was preferable, but for the cost difference, I might have seen where that was going. It's hard, right? Because you have to juggle so many things. But you might have been able to see where the Daniel Jones situation was going and sign Nick Mullins instead. But the Vikings kind of got swooped in on that, and they got beat out by the Jags in terms of what they were willing to offer initially. So Nick Mullins is going to end up in Jacksonville, and the Vikings are kind of stuck high and dry without a backup quarterback for now. But those are the departures that I know of as of today. There's certainly a couple players that are still out there that might command big deals, right? The two corners from last year, Stephon Gilmore and Shaq Griffin, could sign significant contracts. To be honest, both of those guys signed kind of late last year. I wouldn't expect either of them to necessarily sign before the compensatory window closes. So it's kind of hard to count on either of those for comp picks. Cam Robinson is probably the big one, right? The left tackle we were traded for to fill in for Christian Darrisaw as he was hurt last year. He hasn't signed with anybody. Some tackles got big money in free agency. He wasn't one of them. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what money he's able to get. And if he's trying to drag it out a bit to find the best situation or get the best payday or skip OTAs or something like that, he might not end up in comp pick formula type of territory. And then Dalton Risner is also kind of the only other player who might command that level of salary. Obviously, he's waited until the last minute for the last 2 years to re-sign with the Vikings or sign with the Vikings for the first time 2 years ago, and has not gotten nearly as much money as it might have been anticipated in his market. So I don't think he's going to count towards the comp pick formula. So the Vikings are kind of stuck right now in terms of guys that have left, preventing them from kind of signing everybody else if they want to retain that third round comp pick, right? So those are the guys that are left. Kind of quick thoughts on them, and we'll flip it over to the re-signings. So first re-signing, and all my stuff is going to be in order, or these re-signings are in order of like the total value of the deal, right? So Byron Murphy is the big one. It was initially reported 3 years, $66 million, but it's actually 3 years, $54 million, which is $18 million a year. It's $38.78 million, kind of an odd number, but that's the total guarantees. And there are $4 million a year in incentives, which are all not likely to be earned. So I'm kind of interested in what they are, right? Because Murphy made the Pro Bowl this year, so Pro Bowl isn't included as an incentive. There's probably all pro incentives and then team success. And he also had like 6 or 7 interceptions or something like that, right? So it's either a really high number of interceptions or team success, like making the conference championship game, making the Super Bowl, stuff like that in the incentives. But still, $18 million a year is a really strong deal for Byron Murphy. I think it was almost absolutely necessary for the Vikings to do this. Corners went very quick on the first day, including DJ Reed and Travarius Ward, who were kind of the guys Nick and I had honed in on as interested for the Vikings to sign. So with those guys being gone, and Carlton Davis as well, kind of signed very early on for like $20 million a year. With those guys being gone, Murphy was the logical choice. And I think it makes a lot of sense to bring him back into the fold. The Vikings run a pretty complicated and unique defense. So having a veteran with a lot of experience in that role can help, whether it's young players or even just new players coming into the system and kind of work together there. I think he does a really good job of being versatile and, excelling at all of the different things the Vikings try to ask him to do. So I'm really happy to bring him back. They maybe could have saved a little bit of money if they'd done it last offseason, like I was trying to suggest, after I thought he had a very successful first year as a Viking. But hey, it's hard to criticize teams for doing that because players have to want to come to the table as well, right? And sometimes they just want to bet on themselves. So there's that. Aaron Jones was the second big signing, also a critical re-signing because I thought he was the best running back on the market. He got 2 years, $20 million, that's $10 million a year with $11.5 million guaranteed, right? So that's a really strong deal, especially for a player who's over 30, $10 million in the first year, or really $11.5 million in the paid for 1 year. What it functionally is, right? Because the second year he gets like $9 million of salary unguaranteed. So just a really strong deal for Jones. I think he's a really high quality player. And I'm glad that he is back with the Vikings for 2 years because, again, I thought the options in free agency were bad, and I didn't want the Vikings to shoehorn themselves into getting a running back in the draft. So very happy with the deal. Harrison Smith is back on a 1 year, $11.25 million deal is the reporting that I've seen. I've also seen $10.25 million, but I think, okay, so part of the issue may be I am wrapping in like the per game roster bonuses and the workout bonuses and all that stuff into the totals here. And that just makes sense because it's what the player will get paid if they play all of their games. And Harrison Smith played in all 17 games last year, right? So it's going to count against the cap that way. But I think it's $10.25 million in salary and then up to $1 million in workout bonuses and per game roster bonuses total. So it turns out to be $11.25 million. Obviously, his contract was slated to be the league minimum. So that's a $10 million bump basically to the Vikings cap hit for him this year, which is fine. They have the space to absorb that, and I'll get into the cap later, but it's great to see Harrison Smith back. Obviously, he's a franchise legend. Certainly want him to retire a Viking, and I think he's still played at a relatively high level last year, right? He's not peak Harrison Smith, who's like who should be a Hall of Famer, was the best safety in the NFL for that time frame, maybe technically the second best if you count Earl Thomas, but like I think he was better than everybody else, even though like Cam Chancellor and some crap made the all decade team. I think he was a top 2 safety in the 2010s, right? And he's a franchise legend, really smart guy on the back end. Super excited to have him back for 1 more year. And then beyond that, we extended Theo Jackson. And it was, the reporting around this was weird. I think just the initial report was worded incorrectly because he got a 3-year deal worth up to 12.625 or whatever, 615 or whatever it was, $1 million. The first report was like from his agency that it was a 2-year, $12.615 million deal, right? So like that reporting said it went through 2027, right? So it was like, okay, did the Vikings tender him, which he was a restricted free agent, so they could have tendered him at a 0 round or no original round tender, and then do they add the tender onto that 12 million? What's the deal? Well, it turns out that the full terms of the deal are 3 years, $9.365 million. So $3 million a year, roughly, right? And that's the full term. So we don't get up to the 12 million unless we hit some incentives. That's $3 million a year, $5.38 million full guaranteed, and that's in the first 2 years, right? So it's not high level starter money, but I think the Vikings are making a bet similar to the one that they did with Josh Metellus a couple of years ago of they've had Theo Jackson in the system. It's been really obvious that they've liked him. There was so much hype for him coming out of camp last year. He hasn't gotten the opportunity to play on defense because the defensive backs have been healthy. Like his most snaps in 2023 came out of the game that Harrison Smith missed, right? Like, and that's pretty much the extent of the Vikings' injuries at safety over the past 2 years. They've been incredibly lucky in terms of being healthy at that position. So while Jackson has come in and out of the lineup, it's been mostly as an injury replacement. So there's that with Jackson. But it's clear that the Viking staff really likes him, and I think they think he will be ready to step into a starting role in 2025, which is why they signed him to this contract. Also, Ryan Wright, the punter, got 1 year for $1.75 million. There's $400,000 guaranteed in that contract, so the Vikings don't take all that big of a haircut if they decide they want to cut Ryan Wright. This contract screams to me that the Vikings are going to try to bring in some sort of competition for him. I don't think it'll be serious competition, or when I say serious competition, right, I don't think they're going to be trying very hard to replace him, but they'll probably bring in an undrafted free agent punter. Maybe they bring in one of the best punters from the UFL or some nonsense like that, right? Like they brought in John Parker Romo last year as a kicker. Or, maybe there's somebody who gets cut around the league that they bring in for a minimum contract and kind of see if they can beat out Ryan Wright in camp, right? And then they choose to cut Wright if they can, if a player does beat him out. So overall, it's not a huge deal for Wright. It's not a super strong deal for Wright. There's not a lot of security there, but that's kind of the life as a punter if you're not one of the best ones in the league. And as I've kind of talked about previously, I don't think Wright is all that great of a punter. So I do want the Vikings to give at least some sort of effort to replace him rather than just assuming he'd have the job. So of the re-signings, the Vikings really tied themselves to Byron Murphy for at least 2 years and Theo Jackson for at least 2 years just because of the guarantees. Aaron Jones is only tied to 1 year of his 2-year deal, but they made pretty strong commitments to, kind of all of those players just with how they structured the deal, right? They get what they're supposed to be earning in year one up front. It's not a situation like the cap hits look like it, right? Because they're backloaded deals in terms of the cap hits because the Vikings use a signing bonus in year one, which spreads that cap hit out over the length of the contract. But the actual cash that the players are getting is strong in year one. So the Vikings don't save like they're not paying Aaron Jones like $5 million in year one and then can save $15 million by cutting in year two, right? It's not kind of fake money like we've seen in some contracts around the NFL. Tyreek Hill is the biggest, most recent example where he had like a $40 million salary in like 2025 or 2026 on his original extension when he signed it with the Dolphins. And it's like, obviously this guy is not going to play for that much cash in that season. It's just there to pump up the overall numbers of the contract to $30 million per year. So that's a little bit of a digression there, but the Vikings, the players got really strong deals for themselves in free agency. And I don't think that's just to be clear, I don't think that's like a failure of negotiation on the Vikings part. I think that's how you should do business in the NFL. Like you should be upfront and consistent about how you sign the contracts with the players and not try to dupe them into thinking it's a bigger number than it is, because that just creates unhappiness and contract restructuring down the line. And I'm pretty sure that Tyreek Hill deal got restructured once it got to that point. So, again, strong contracts for the players in terms of the value that they're getting on it, but also the Vikings needed to sign these guys, and I don't think they overpaid necessarily for any of them. Theo Jackson, obviously, is somebody they think can be a starter, and if he's a starter next year, at $3 million a year and plays reasonably well, like that's a steal for the amount. Byron Murphy, I think, deserves $18 million a year. I think he played up to that level of a corner. Obviously, the highest level of that market is $25 million a year, or actually today, Derek Stingley just signed a $30 million a year extension, which is a little bit silly because, it's kind of like the Darisaw deal where it doesn't hit for 2 years because he's entering the 4th year of his rookie deal, and then you have the 5th year option, and then you tack 3 years onto that, and that's where the $90 million hits. But whereas Byron Murphy, starts getting paid $18 million a year today, as opposed to 2 years from now. But still, the top of the market is well above $18 million. And I think Murphy is in that second tier of corners who he can be the best corner on your team, but he's also not going to, be able to go one-on-one against a Justin Jefferson or shut down your opponent's best player necessarily, right? He's going to take some losses here and there as a defender. So, those are all the re-signings. I think very critical in terms of Byron Murphy and Aaron Jones. Awesome in terms of Harrison Smith, and the Vikings kind of put their safety room together and are keeping their defensive back room as close together as they can, right? All the guys last year felt like 1-year Band-Aids, or early Shaq Griffin and Stephon Gilmore were the 1-year Band-Aids, but they kind of kept everybody else together, with the exception of Bynum leaving the door. But Jackson is the replacement plan for Bynum. So he was already in-house. It feels pretty good from that perspective to me. If we go outside is where the real bonanza happened for the Vikings and the guys we get really excited about, right? So the first and the major and my favorite signing is right guard Will Fries. My name is Matt Fries. It is spelled Fries, just like Will Fries' last name. He pronounces it Fries. I pronounce it Fries. I'm probably going to make jokes about that as we continue to go on, but that's just how it is. As far as I know, I'm not related to him. But he comes over from the Colts. He gets a 5-year, $87.72 million in total value. That's about $17.5 million a year. I just kind of rounded it to there. And he got $34 million guaranteed, right? So that's the first 2 years of that deal, basically fully guaranteed. 17 times 2 is 34. With the rest of it non-guaranteed, right? So it's a deal the Vikings can get out from under within 2 years if it doesn't work out. Obviously, Fries was playing really well last year by all reports, and Brandon Thorne, who I really trust for offensive line play, had him as his top interior offensive lineman available in free agency. He's supposed to be a dominant finisher, and I'm really excited to get to the tape to kind of see that nasty level of play, because I think it's something the Vikings have needed for a long time in the interior, and that kind of strength and ability to finish is something that some of the lighter players they've had over the years have lacked. I actually don't think it was a downside to Ed Ingram's game, right? It was just much more of a consistency thing with Ed Ingram than necessarily a level of nastiness or anything. But Ed Ingram's gone, Will Fries is in, and I'm stoked about it, right? Because I think the Vikings finally kind of shored up their interior offensive line after it being bad for like my entire time really paying attention in depth to the Vikings, right? I think back to probably the 2010, 2011 timeframe was when I really started, paying in depth attention to the Vikings. And since the 2012 year where we had like Brandon Fusco, John Sullivan, and I'm blanking on the third guy, really playing well on the interior to pave the way for Adrian Peterson's 2,000-yard year. The Vikings have not had quality play since they kind of messed around with Fusco's position and gave him that extension, and it didn't work out. With that being said, they also added from the Colts Ryan Kelly, the center, right? And all of these guys that they've added basically have had injury issues in the past, or I should say the high level guys, the top 4 guys that they added had injury issues in 2024, right? Ryan Kelly had a neck problem and then had a knee injury that actually ended up going on IR for, but he came back by the end of the year. So Kelly's 32. He got 2 years, $18 million. That's $9 million a year with $8.39 million guaranteed. There's a little bit of a discrepancy between the reporting I've seen from Ben Gessling, which says he got like $6 million as a signing bonus versus what's on the over the cap page, which has it as a roster bonus. I went with it as a signing bonus, so there is a little bit of money in year 2 if you cut him, but the Vikings also save like $9 million in year 2 if you cut him, right? So it's a 1-year deal. If it doesn't work out, they can easily move on and save money in the second year of the deal. For a 32-year-old player coming off of an injury, that is, a really important way that you want to structure your deal, obviously. But it's kind of a win for the Vikings, and they get to see what they have in Kelly. We think he's really good still, or we think he's still a quality starting center, which is maybe a little bit more than they've had in Garrett Bradbury, right? Bradbury's been maybe a little bit of a below average starting center. I don't think he's been the worst guy in the league. And, here and Luke Braun at Locked On Vikings have kind of caped for Bradbury a little bit over the course of his time. But Kelly definitely shores up a little bit of the power problem that Bradbury had. It sounds like from, again, reading Brandon Thorne's work over at the Trench Warfare Substack, Kelly has lost a little bit of that strength that he had early on in his career, but still has the athleticism to play at a high level. So he might get beat with strength, but I think he's just going to anchor better than Garrett Bradbury, because Bradbury was not good at it at all. So, it's kind of a win for the Vikings to swap that out. Obviously, JJ McCarthy gets a veteran signal caller has been, in the league and played center at a high level for a long time. So really helps him up front with protections and that sort of thing. Then the Vikings also added 2 interior defensive linemen in Jonathan Allen from Washington and Javon Hargrave from the 49ers. Big contracts to both. Both guys were guys that were cut from their previous teams. So they don't count against the compensatory formula, which was a huge key. They gave Allen, who's a couple years younger. Allen's 30. Hargrave is 32. I think going to be 33 this year. Allen might be 31 this year. I forget what his birthday is. But so Allen gets a contract that's 3 years, $51 million with that's $17 million a year, but $23.255 million fully guaranteed. So it kind of makes it a 1-year deal, right? Because you pay him a bunch of money in year one, roughly $17 million in year one, and then you can kind of get off the hook with only owing him about $6 million guaranteed in year two, or the cap hit will be a little bit larger than that because of prorated money, because of the signing bonus, but he'll still save money against the cap, importantly, and I'll get into that in a little bit, if you cut him after that first year. So that's kind of what you want, right? I see Allen as a little bit of a stouter run defender than what I see from Hargrave, so I'd expect Allen to kind of play the Jonathan Bullard role on early downs and then become a rotational pass rusher with Hargrave on later downs. Is kind of how I see it, right? So you want him two-gapping a little bit more, playing the run a little bit more than what you want from Hargrave. And then, you'll keep him in on some passing downs, or you try to keep both guys fresh and have a little bit more of a rotation when you take Harrison Phillips off the field. Or if you're in a fringe kind of scenario where the team might run or pass and might lean a pass a little bit, but you still want to be stout against the run, maybe you can have both Allen and Hargrave on the field. And take Harrison Phillips off, as opposed to what the Vikings were doing last year, right? Which was just putting 4 edge rushers on the field in passing situations, which really compromised their ability to defend the run. And they got a couple times on that. Hargrave himself, I think, is like very much a bad run defender at this point, right? So I'd want him maybe off the field on early downs. And that's kind of where you could get your Jalen Redmond some snaps, or Taki Taimani or Levi Drake Rodriguez some snaps on early downs as the third interior defender, as opposed to Javon Hargrave being out there. But mostly, if Hargrave is on the field in those situations, he's a Jerry Tillery replacement. And then on third downs, I think he's a Jihad Ward replacement, right? So we're kind of getting 2 players worth of snaps out of 1 player in Javon Hargrave. And if you add up Tillery and Ward's snaps, that would come out to like 80% of the snaps. So I'm not saying Hargrave would actually play, the total level of snaps that those guys did, but I think he's going to fill both roles. And then we can rotate other players like Allen into those scenarios on the third downs where Jihad Ward might have been the interior pass rusher, or we can rotate in, if we like what we're seeing from them, the 3 guys backing him up, all of whom I think are pretty good prospects, especially for where they came from in Redmond, Rodriguez, and Taimani. So that's kind of my thought process there. By the way, if I didn't mention Hargrave's contract, he got 2 years, $30 million, $15 million a year. There's $18.2 million fully guaranteed on that deal. He has $4 million in guarantees in the second year. So, you do take a little bit of dead cap if you cut him after year one, but you still save $11 million against the cap doing so. So at the end of the day, like it would be a no-brainer if he doesn't work out at all. I should mention that Allen had a torn pec last year that caused him to miss a bunch of time, although he did come back for the playoffs. And Hargrave had a torn triceps. He only played in 3 games last year for the 49ers, right? So Hargrave has been one of the most dominant, and I should have gotten into this when talking about Hargrave. I kind of trashed his run defense for a little bit and didn't talk about him as a pass rusher, but he was like an absurdly dominant interior pass rusher for the Eagles, on their Super Bowl run in 2022. And also, I think, played pretty well as a pass rusher for the 49ers in 2023 before getting hurt last year, right? So the hope is that he would still have the pass rush juice that he was showing with the Eagles and the 49ers, or at least be able to tap into that in stretches and kind of, boost the interior pass rush for the Vikings. And I think it's a pretty solid bet for a fair amount of money in year one, but a contract that's easy to get out of in year 2. Like I really like the Vikings taking bets on 2 guys at that position instead of just one, right? Because if Jonathan Allen doesn't play well and there's a downside and he doesn't live up to his contract, and you had only signed him, you're kind of screwed at the interior. If Javon Hargrave doesn't play well and doesn't live up to his contract at all, isn't able to recapture that, you're screwed if you only signed him. But if you sign both guys, there's a decent chance that at least one of them hits, right? Even if the other one's kind of a disaster, then you just move on from him after year 1 and you're happy that you signed a guy that really worked out. So I love the bet of kind of signing 2 guys at the position, hoping that at least one will work out of those 2. I think you really increase your chances of having a good pass rush from your interior, which is something we've been begging the Vikings to add for years at this point, right? So I'm pretty glad that they were able to work both of those out. Obviously, it means players like Jonathan Bullard or Jerry Tillery, who I should have brought him up earlier. I think he signed with the Chiefs, although the contract details aren't out yet. I don't know if Bullard has signed anywhere yet. I don't think he has. At least I haven't seen that reported. So those are the big signings. And the third, significant money signing excuse me, I said third. I meant 5th significant money signing for the Vikings is Isaiah Rodgers, the corner from the Eagles. He was originally with the Colts. He got suspended for a full season for gambling. I think the guys that got suspended for a full season were like gambling on football, but I don't think that either they were not gambling on their own games or they were gambling like for their team to do well on their own games, right? Which would have avoided like a lifetime ban, or they were gambling on like college sports or something like that. I don't know the full details. Probably shouldn't have brought any of it up in terms of speculation, in terms of what it was, but just understand that I don't really know what the deal was. He got suspended for the full year for gambling, got released by the Colts, got signed by the Eagles, played like 3 games where he ended up being a starter because of injuries to Darius Slay, or I don't know if Quinyon Mitchell got hurt. I don't know what the circumstances to him starting were, but he started roughly 3 games, full snaps, played a bunch of snaps in the Rams playoff game. And then, it was a pretty limited backup player. He has some special teams chops where he's been a kick returner before. I don't know if he plays on the other versions of special teams, but that's okay. He got a 2-year, $11 million deal. That's $5.5 million per year. There's $5.525 million guaranteed. So basically half of it. So, he can easily be cut after year 1, but is going to be in the mix to start at outside corner for the Vikings, basically, because on the roster right now, they have Byron Murphy, Isaiah Rodgers, Mekhi Blackman, and then it gets down to like Dwight McGlothern and those guys, right? So not really a ton of options at corner. I don't know if I would say Isaiah Rodgers, or I would say Isaiah Rodgers is not a guy I would count on to be a bona fide starter, right? My understanding is he played pretty well, and he is an outside corner. He's like 5'9" and weighed in at like 170 something at the combine, right? But he has played outside over the course of his career. The concern I would have there is Byron Murphy's like 5'9". Isaiah Rodgers is like 5'9". Mekhi Blackman is 5'11", but he also weighed in at like 170 pounds, right? The Vikings don't have any size in the cornerback room right now. So I would love to see them try to add somebody beyond what they have in Rodgers and Murphy and Blackman and, even Dwight McGlothern, right? Who, look, I was happy with what Dwight McGlothern has done so far. I thought he was a good prospect for UDFA. He's still a UDFA, so I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch with Dwight McGlothern. I'm not saying he's a guy that can't turn into a potential starter for the Vikings, but it's just so rare that those guys actually do that I'm not going to count him in the mix until he proves that he is. So I'd really like the Vikings to pursue signing somebody, whether it's bringing Shaq Griffin or Stephon Gilmore back, to try to bolster that cornerback room even more, on top of adding Rodgers. So some others reported signings that the Vikings have include Tavier Thomas, who they signed from the Bucs. He is a super special teamer. He is a defensive back. I think my understanding is he mostly played slot. throughout his career, and he's had a decent amount of starting experience on defense. It's just not a position I think you want to put him in, right? You want him to be the Trent Sherfield where he gets maybe a couple snaps on defense, but is primarily a special teamer and can do all the things well in terms of gunning and blocking and that sort of thing on special teams, rather than being a starter for you on defense. He got 1 year, $2 million with $1 million guaranteed, is the reporting I've seen. They also signed Bubba Bolden, who's a defensive back, I believe a safety, who played in the UFL last year. I don't really know much about him. He's probably another long shot, like a Jalen Redmond from last year, who they identified as a high level, who they identified as somebody that they thought was really good in the UFL and just wanted to bring him into camp. I don't expect that to be anything more than like a minimum contract, kind of like what Jalen Redmond got. They also signed Justin School from the Bucks. He's a swing tackle. He started 5 games last year due to injury for the Bucks, so I kind of expect him to be the Vikings' answer until Christian Darrisaw comes back at left tackle. I don't know much about him, haven't really watched any of his game. We don't know the money on that one either, but I would expect is under kind of the $3 million range or the $2.5 million range that the Johnny Muntz and the Trent Sherfields got, because the Vikings are going to want to stay under the compensatory pick level to kind of maintain that pick for Sam Darnold. And then they also signed Eric Wilson from the Packers, and also obviously formerly of the Minnesota Vikings, the safety convert out of Cincinnati to linebacker, who, you know, was kind of the backup or the third guy in some of the Eric Kendricks, Anthony Barr years. You know, Wilson was always kind of more of a coverage guy than he was a run defense guy, but he's also played a significant amount of special teams over the course of his career. This is your Kamu Grugier-Hill replacement, right? A guy who got snaps in emergency when guys got hurt and isn't going to embarrass himself when he gets put on the field, but also not a guy you want starting long-term, which is fine because the Vikings have Ivan Pace and Blake Cashman as their starters at interior linebacker, right? So I think that's a totally fine move. It's kind of neat that they brought a guy who was previously with the team back. But yeah, just kind of fun. And then the other 2 moves the Vikings made, obviously, were trading Ed Ingram. Or I'm sorry, I didn't fix my notes yet. So they traded Ed Ingram to the Houston Texans. That got them a 2026 6th round pick, which they turned around and used as part of a trade for the 49ers for Jordan Mason, who they gave 2 years, I believe $12 million to, with $7 million guaranteed. Yeah, $12 million with $7 million guaranteed. So they traded in Ingram, got their original 6th round pick, which they sent to the Texans in the Cam Akers trade, back, and then used that pick to go pick up Jordan Mason right away. Included in the Jordan Mason trade was also a 5th, 6th swap with the 49ers. So the 49ers got one of our 5th round picks, probably the Vikings' original 5th round pick, and the Vikings got the 49ers' 6th round pick in this draft. So the Vikings now went from having the 1, their 3, and 2 5s to a 1, the 3 for Kirk Cousins, 97 overall, and a 5 and a 6 this year. I think I saw they went down 27 spots with that trade. I'm totally fine with it. The contract for Jordan Mason, as I mentioned, 2 years, $12 million, $7 million guaranteed. Probably can move on from him, save roughly, $3 or $4 million next year if it doesn't work out. But I'm in love with the Jordan Mason addition. My biggest exposure to him, other than being like a fantasy darling over the first half of last year, was obviously the week 2 Vikings game, where I thought he was a really quality runner, just in terms of how he's executing the zone concepts, his physicality after contact, and his ability to push the pile and that sort of thing. So definitely happy with that as a second option, because going into that trade, I was hammering kind of that the Vikings needed somebody to back up Aaron Jones still, right? They've been vocal about wanting to lighten Jones's workload. He had the biggest workload of his career at age 30 last year. And Mason absolutely does this. He's somebody you can rotate in very effectively, much better than a Cam Akers level player. So I'm all on board for this. And I think the Vikings should probably still look at investing in the draft. But now I don't think they need to invest a second or third round pick at running back, right? It's maybe somebody they like and think can sneak under the radar in the later rounds with that 5th or 6th round pick. And this running back class is supposed to be ridiculously deep, right? Everybody who talks about the running back class says there are way more draftable prospects at running back than they've seen in the past. So I think it's a good year to want a running back with a late round pick. Because my understanding of the top of the class is outside of Ashton Genty, like a lot of the guys aren't like really all that first round caliber, but they might just get pushed up because of the weaknesses at other spots in the class or how good people are saying this running back class is overall. So, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition there. But I think wanting to get a running back in the 5th or 6th round is the position the Vikings want to be in. And they've done that with the Jordan Mason trade. If I go back to Ed Ingram, I think it was like the writing was very obvious once Will Fries was signed that Ed Ingram was no longer going to be on the team because he had I thought it was like $3-something million, right? And that was the original number on Over the Cap, but I guess performance incentives would have put it up over $5 million, which is great to get rid of for the Vikings. Not a quality starter, like a somewhat acceptable to put on the field type of player, and then really with pretty strong deficiencies in terms of how he was consistently beat the same way in pass protection, inconsistent in the run game in terms of how he's executing things, because you'd have doubles that he was on that were awesome and he looked great, and then you have times where it's like, dude, you're not, like where he just was not either getting to his guy or just got beat way too quickly by the guy he was against. So pretty happy with that. I have the number as saves 3.4 million. At least it saved 3.4 million against the over the cap numbers, right, for the Vikings. Garrett Bradbury also was announced, and I'm recording this on Monday, that he was cut, right? The Vikings tried to dangle him out there for a trade over the weekend, and nobody bit on it for pretty obvious reasons, because he's not a quality starting center. He was owed about $5 million in cash this year. So no team kind of wanted to take on that deal. And whereas Garrett Bradbury is like almost 30 years old, basically, Ed Ingram's still a rookie contract player, technically, right? So you can see why a team is like, okay, we like this guy in the draft. We want him as a reclamation project for Ed Ingram. Whereas Garrett Bradbury, he's been in the league for 6 years, right? You're not improving on that. And honestly, maybe he's on the downswing, right? Just based on his age, because he's an older prospect coming out even. So you're not really going to be willing to send much for that, even if he started for like 6 straight years or whatever it was for the Vikings. It sounds like they post June 1st in him, which is kind of like a column A, column B thing. Like I would want to take my medicine right away in terms of those cuts and just take all of it this year. But they pushed $1.6 million of the cap hit into the future. It's like, okay, so they saved $5.25 million overall over the course of 2 seasons. And they actually save all of that money right now. And then they'll save they save $5.25 million right now, and they would have had a $1.62 billion dead cap hit for him next year anyway, because of the void years that were on the deal. So that stays in place, right? Otherwise they would have just saved $3.6 million this year. And technically until June 1st, because they made the June 1st cut, they will have $3.6 million in extra cap space, and then they'll get the extra 1.6 once June 1st hits. So it'll be like this is what we use to help sign the 52nd and 53rd player once that ends, and all the practice squad players kind of money for that post June 1st cut. So, with all that information, I think I want to go quick and go over where the Vikings currently sit from a comp pick situation. I've made references to it. They currently have the number 97 overall pick in the 2026 draft because of the Sam Darnold deal. Darnold's contract is the largest one that was handed out in free agency and is going to be the largest one that was handed out in free agency because nobody's going to want to pay, I guess, Russell Wilson that much money, right? Milton Williams is probably second at this point at $26 million a year. Obviously, defenders or any players don't get as much as quarterbacks, right? So getting that out of the way real quick, the compensatory free agents for the Vikings that left that count are Sam Darnold, Cam Bynum, Daniel Jones, and Pat Jones. I would count Trent Sherfield on the fringe, although Nick Corte, the over the caps guru for this sort of thing, don't really have his contract on the books there at all. If you look at their full list, like the $2.5 million range, 50% of the snaps was kind of the cutoff last year. Obviously, that's going to increase with the salary cap going up, but I didn't know how much it was. So $3 million may be in that ballpark, but we're not counting it right now. If you look at the compensatory free agents that the Vikings added, it's Will Fries, Ryan Kelly, and Isaiah Rodgers. That's it. Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave don't count. Tavierre Thomas, his report was $2 million. I don't think Bolden, School, or Eric Wilson are anything over that. Or if they signed Rondale Moore, who visited and I guess is now visiting the Bears, or like a Jeff Okudah, who I guess is scheduled to visit the Vikings as well. If they sign those guys, they won't cross that threshold either, so they won't count, right? And even if they're like close, if we give a $3 million contract and $3 million counts all of a sudden, well then Trent Sherfield's $3 million will probably count too, right? So it'll probably get canceled out. Just the way that works. So at the end of the day, the Vikings right now, you have Cam Bynum canceling out like Will Fries. You have Daniel Jones canceling out Ryan Kelly, and you have Isaiah Rodgers canceling out Pat Jones. But you get Sam Darnold left alone at the top at the number 97 overall pick. So thank you, Sam Darnold, Cam Bynum, Daniel Jones, and Pat Jones for getting the Vikings the 97th overall pick in the 2026 draft, assuming there are no changes. So that's the quick comp pick update there. I wanted to get into a couple other things after going over all these signings, because I think there's something pretty interesting if you look at where the Vikings cap space is currently at, and then where the Vikings are going to be next year. And I kind of wrote an article in Zone Coverage talking about how the Vikings are now over the cap in 2026. So if you look at it, and I've made projections for each of the Vikings free agent signings that haven't been announced. So, right, I have the numbers for all the guys the Vikings did actually sign that have been reported mostly to Ben Gessling. Thank you again, Ben, for giving us all that information. But I also added in Bubba Bolden, Justin School, Eric Wilson, and Jordan Mason with contract projections to this list. So right now, over the cap has the Vikings at $30.5 million in effective cap space. My number for effective cap space for the Vikings is calculated a little bit differently than what over the cap does. So over the cap right now, I believe just uses the top 51 cap space and then adds in the difference with draft picks, right? So the Vikings first round draft pick number 24 overall is slotted to get an exact amount of money. Will count a certain amount against the cap this year. That's greater than the cheapest player on the Vikings top 51 right now, right? Who makes $840,000 a year. And the same is true for like the third round pick and the fifth round pick and stuff like that. So that number is, so those differences, they calculate and throw into effective cap space. They also get you up to 51 players. If you don't have 51 players on your roster, obviously the Vikings don't have that problem. So that $30.5 million is what over the cap is right now. However, it doesn't account for a couple things. So I also decided to account for the Vikings to add players up to 53 players on the roster, because that's what you'll have to do once you actually get to the regular season, right? Is instead of 51, which is the top 51 for the offseason, you go up to 53 for your standard roster throughout the season. And you also have to play practice squad players, which is, it's like only $250,000 per player. There are some players that can go up to basically $400,000, but that's still 16 total players, right? So it's a couple $1 million overall over the course of the season. So it really makes a difference. And I don't think over the cap includes that in their effective cap space right now. It will hit the cap and it will factor into their calculations once the season actually starts and we have practice squads. But it's important to plan for it now. And the Vikings are certainly planning for it now because you have to get it to, work out for the Vikings. So with all of that being said, and including the projections for contracts that Over the Cap doesn't have yet because the details haven't been fully reported, I have the Vikings at $25.1 million or $25.2 million in cap space for 2025 functionally. And that's a decent amount of cap space, right? They can sign a lot of players under that, and it's pretty impressive considering they've gone through and handed out like signing bonuses worth something in the order of $90 million and, a ton of guaranteed money, like $150 roughly $1 million in guaranteed money, or, I have 313. It's probably something like 312 in reported total contract value this offseason. It's impressive that they went from like $60 million at cap space at the start of the offseason to just $25 million now, or they've only spent down to $25 million in cap space. The reason they've done that is because all of these contracts that they've signed have had large signing bonuses and minimal salaries in year one of the deal, right? So that spreads your signing bonus money. It prorates it over the course of up to 5 years, depending on the length of the contract. If you have void years, it'll go all the way to 5 years, and Byron Murphy and Aaron Jones have that. None of the other guys have been reported to have void years, so I haven't put that into my calculation, but it would even lower their first year cap hits even further if they did. The thing is, the Vikings didn't give any of these guys low salaries in year two, right? So whereas like Byron Murphy gets paid like $2 million in total comp, and most of the guys get paid $2 million in total comp. That's their base salary plus workout and per game roster bonuses. So I have Byron Murphy at like $2.03 million. I have Aaron Jones at $2 million on the dot in terms of total salary in year one. Will Fry is $2 million on the dot. Ryan Kelly, $2.615 million in salary. Jordan Mason, my estimate is $2 million just because all these contracts are like $2 million. Jonathan Allen, $2.205 million. Javon Hargrave, $2.055 million. Basically, all these guys, they're paying $2 million plus their signing bonus, right? Which is like up to $10 million for most of these players. So they're getting roughly their average annual value in cash, right? And if I go back to the example of Javon Hargrave, he's making $2.055 million in total compensation from salary, per game roster bonuses, and workout bonuses this year. He got a $12.945 million signing bonus. You add those two numbers together, you get $15 million. So he's getting $15 million in cash this year, and his salary plus the per game roster bonus and workout bonus stuff is $15 million total next year. So $15 million in cash year one, $15 million in cash year two for the player. The reality for the cap hit, though, is it costs the Vikings only $8.5 million against the cap this year and $21.5 roughly million against the cap next year, right? So cash stays the same for the player. Cap hit basically gets deferred for a full year and almost triples, right? From year one to year two, more than doubles. That's a totally fine way to build a roster. It just pushed a lot of the money, and it's totally valid. And I'll get into a little bit deeper of this for the Vikings to do all of this stuff. It just pushed a lot of the money from the 2025 cap into the 2026 cap, which I haven't said this here yet, but the reason the Vikings have $25 million in cap space is because I have them at minus $43 million in 2026 cap space. Over the cap is a little bit kinder in their effective cap space. They have them at minus $26 million, but that's still 32nd in the league, right, in terms of total cap space. Now, my projection theoretically includes, all of the things the Vikings will have to pay for. So theoretically, in this world, the Vikings would be able to roll over about $25 million in cap space. based on my numbers, that would still put them almost $18 million in the hole next year, right? And even if my numbers are wrong for some reason, which the difference between my numbers and the over the cap numbers for 2026 is, I believe over the cap counts players whose deals are voiding as like players for the purposes of how they get to 51 total players, right? So, trying to think of an example. Andrew Van Ginkel's contract voids next year, so he's not scheduled to be a Minnesota Viking. But the way it's listed on over the cap, it still like counts as a contract for them. And the Vikings have like 5 or 6 players that have this. So because they have all of those players that have this, their total count for players on the Vikings is off. So when you multiply the minimum salary times, whatever number of players that is, they are just adding fewer players than I am. So I have 26 total players that the Vikings will need. I think over the cap's down to like 17 or 18 total players. That costs a lot more against the cap than what they're showing, which is why I have $43 million in space as opposed to over the cap's $25 million below or above the cap, I should say. So again, even with rollover, that's $17 million in the hole next year. If you look at 2027, it's a lot healthier. Even if you go to the full extent of assuming, the Vikings need to add this many players, they'll have roughly $54 million in cap space. If you don't look at adding for the top 51 or whatever, like the base number that you see when you get over the cap in a certain year, they'll have $97 million. So it's pretty easy for them to get that money back. And then as I talked about with the contracts, right, a lot of these guys are only on what are functionally 1-year deals, or the Vikings can get out of them very easily after 1 year. So here's the money that guys that the Vikings signed this offseason can save if they cut them in 2026. Aaron Jones saves $2.4 million, and a lot of that money is sunk cost from last year's contract that we gave Aaron Jones, that we put a ton of void years and stuff like that on. So, it's money we were going to have to pay anyway, and money that was going to hit this year if he did not re-sign. Isaiah Rodgers saves $3 million. Ryan Kelly saves $8.75 million. Over the cap has him at $12 million, but again, I think their roster bonus is actually a signing bonus for that. Jonathan Allen saves $4.3 million. Javon Hargrave saves $11 million, right? So the Vikings can get out from under any of these deals saving money, except for the Will Fries and Byron Murphy deal. Also, I think they save a little bit of money on the Theo Jackson deal technically, because he has like per game roster bonuses and stuff like that aren't fully guaranteed. But he would basically zero out. So, they signed 2 players who were both, I believe, entering their age 28 season in Byron Murphy and Will Fries, 2 deals that they can't get out of next year, but everybody else, including Ryan Kelly, who's over 30, Aaron Jones, who's over 30, Jonathan Allen, who's over 30, and Javon Hargrave, who's over 30, they can get out of and save money against the cap next year, which will help them with their current negative cap space problem. Also, Isaiah Rodgers, if he doesn't work out, he's a younger player still. He's really young. I think he might be the youngest of all of these guys that they signed. Would also still save $3 million. The other mechanism that they would have is using signing bonus conversions to base salary for players to push their money into future years, right? This is the whole void year thing that the Eagles do and the Saints do and the Browns do. They're like the most popular teams, right? And if people probably have visceral reactions to void years, whether it's, oh, we should do those all the time, that's what the Eagles do, or we should never do these, the Saints are in a terrible cap situation because of it, and we really shouldn't be trying to push money out in the future. The reality is, you put it cap space as it is, the ability to push cap hits into future years is essentially a zero interest loan. The way I'll define it is a zero interest loan in an inflationary environment, right? People will call it a negative interest loan. Technically, it's not a negative interest loan because you pay the same amount of money in cap. But, if just like inflation, the value of money goes down over time. So $10 million today is not worth the same in real US dollars as $10 million would be next year, right? The $10 million next year is worth 9 point whatever million dollars in this year's money, unless we go through a period of deflation, right? The cap is always rising. So $10 million against the cap this year is a lower percentage than is a higher percentage than $10 million, than $10 million against the cap next year, right? So the benefit of pushing it out is you're paying a lesser percentage over time. That sounds like a negative interest loan, but you're still paying $10 million, right? So that there's no interest on the loan. It's just the available cap went up, right? So I guess same thing as a negative interest loan, and that's a really pedantic kind of description there. But what is this podcast if not for pendants? So anyway, the Vikings have a ton of triggers where they can convert base salary next year. So I really like actually what they did with this signing and putting themselves over the 2026 cap, because they gave themselves a bunch of optionality, right? So I talked about a little bit about if Jonathan Allen works out and Javon Hargrave doesn't, well, they can just move on from Javon Hargrave. If Javon Hargrave works out and Jonathan Allen doesn't, they can just move on from Jonathan Allen, right? That's what they can do with the cuts by saving the money on these first year players. Also, they can choose to extend the players, or not even extend, but convert salary to signing bonus for the players who are good, and choose not to do that for the players who aren't living up to their potential. I think where the Saints and the Browns really got themselves into trouble is by, namely the quarterbacks, but pushing out cap hits into the future for players they no longer want to really have on the roster, right? For a myriad of reasons, the Browns don't want to have Deshaun Watson on the roster, but the number one reason for the Browns, I guess, is that he's really bad at football, right? But they can't get out from under his contract, because if they were trying to cut him, his cap hit would balloon to a ridiculous number, because they've already paid him all of this money in signing bonuses, and now would have to accelerate into their current cap environment, and there's like literally no way for them to get out from underneath it. So to stay under the cap, they just have to keep restructuring his contract, and it's a little bit ridiculous. Derek Carr is a similar thing for the Saints, where if they had wanted to cut Derek Carr this year, they would have had to maximum restructure basically everybody else on the roster, and they start doing that anyway because they're Saints and they don't manage their cap or players well, in my opinion. And it's mainly player acquisition than the cap, right? Because they keep signing players who aren't good to big deals. And that's where you really get yourself in trouble with this void year and cap stuff, is if you pay cash to players who don't live up to what they are earning in that given year, and then you have to pay for it later when you want to get out of those contracts. Well, the Vikings, by putting themselves over the cap, will force themselves to use salary conversions, or just blatantly cutting players, but more likely salary conversions, to stay under the cap in a future year. The thing is, they have a ton of guys they can choose to do this restructure with. So they can pick and choose who they want to restructure, and only restructure the players that are giving them plus value on the deals that they've signed, right? So the players with over a $6 million base salary in 2026 for the Vikings are Justin Jefferson, who has nearly $25 million in base salary. I don't think anybody's going to complain if the Vikings, max out their credit cards on Justin Jefferson, right? He's a phenomenal player. He's somebody we always expect to be outperforming the deal that he signed, even if it is a top market deal. I mean, now that Jamar Chase got $40 million a year, Justin Jefferson at 35 looks like a great bargain, right? There's Brian O'Neill, who's going to make nearly $19 million in base salary for 2026. There's Jonathan Grenard, who makes over $18 million. Jonathan Allen will make $16 million in salary. TJ Hawkinson, 15.4. Byron Murphy, nearly 15.4. Javon Hargrave, 14.2. Christian Darrisaw, 13.29. Aaron Jones, $9 million. Ryan Kelly, nearly $8 million. Blake Cashman, $6.9 million. Harrison Phillips, $6.89 million, right? So all of these players for the Vikings are making over $6 million in salary. These are all candidates for them to use void years or simple restructures with just signing bonus or salary conversion to signing bonus to get under the cap. As long as they don't do it for all of them, and do it for players who really aren't living up to the value of their contract, they're going to be in really good shape for the cap moving forward. And I would argue they should do this because they want to maximize the potential of the roster that they have right now. And the best way to do that is to push money into future years. That's what's consistently allowed the Eagles to sign as many players as they do to large contracts. So, I think you look at the guys I mentioned above in terms of Aaron Jones, Isaiah Rodgers, Ryan Kelly, John Allen, Javon Hargrave. All those guys would be cut candidates heading into 26. I'm not saying the Vikings should plan to cut any of them, but if they aren't performing up to their standards, the Vikings should look at moving on from those players. On top of that, they could cut Brian O'Neill and save $19.5 million. They could cut Jonathan Grenard and save $12.4 million. They could cut TJ Hawkinson and save $8.9 million. They could cut Harrison Phillips and I believe save $7.5 million. There might be a vest or some sort of thing in there that they need to be careful about around that. Blake Cashman, $4.4 million. Blake Brandel, $3.5 million. Right? So those could be significant savings from either of those players, and I wouldn't project them to cut any of those players right now, but they have the optionality to do that in the future, and I think that's really critical and a really smart piece of how the Vikings have structured these contracts and these cap hits up to that point to give them the consistent ability to make these decisions to refresh the roster if they need to, while also trying to maximize the talent that they're able to put on the roster. So that was a little bit of a rant there in terms of cap stuff, but I really like the way the Vikings have approached this. I'm not concerned about the fact that they're over the 2026 cap, although I do think it's probably going to limit the rest of their spending for 2025. They may sign 1-year deals for some players like a Shaq Griffin or a Stephon Gilmore as stopgap options as we move along here, or somebody who's equivalent to that. I can't think of any positions besides, okay, so a quick run through of the Vikings needs, right? Backup quarterback, they figured out backup running back. A depth wide receiver, that's not going to cost a lot of money. A depth edge player, that's not going to cost a lot of money. Cornerback, a fringe starter, that's the one where it's going to cost a pretty decent amount of money. They signed the swing tackle. They need depth at the interior offensive line, but I don't think that's very expensive, right? So really, cornerback is the only position where I would want to swing for a decent contract right now. But then they also have the cap space to have, larger year one cap hits if they want to extend a player like Josh Metellus or something like that, and just kind of get that guy his money up front and kind of pay for him against the cap up front. So I think they're in a really healthy cap space, despite a somewhat alarming saying, they're over the cap for 2026 right now, because I don't expect them to do much for the rest of free agency. And on top of that, the comp pick is the reason they wouldn't do much unless Cam Robinson gets signed. That kind of frees them up to sign somebody else in the equation, and still keep that Sam Darnold comp pick. Now, if Cam Robinson signs for a significant deal, maybe you want to say, okay, I'll take 2 comp picks next year, right? That's another valid option, especially if it's like a fifth rounder for Daniel Jones or something like that. But I wanted to wrap it up by just giving some deals that got handed out in free agency that I think I might have been interested in the Vikings doing as opposed to what they did, right? So I think the first one is maybe an if Harrison Smith had retired, I think my first priority would have been to bring Cam Bynum back on that 4-year, $60 million deal that I talked about. But I think there are also some good safeties that got strong deals. Or that got deals that were maybe a little bit less than I was expecting, to be honest with you. Like Javon Holland getting 3 years for $45 million, that's $15 million a year, or just over $15 million a year, was a little bit surprisingly on the low end for me. I thought he was going to get a little bit more than what Bynum got. Talanoa Hufanga got 3 for $45 as well. So if you don't like Bynum for some reason, which, like, how can you not love Cam Bynum? He would have been another valid option. And then Justin Reed was the weirdest deal of all to me. He got like 3 years, $30 million to go to the Saints, which, first of all, like, Saints, why are you paying money for this guy who's not going to help you in 3 years when you actually have the potential to be good? Justin Reed, why are you going to this bad football team? And why is he only getting $10 million a year? Like, he was a very quality safety. and kind of the pivot point for that defense for the Chiefs. So it's kind of like that one is a weird decision all around for me. And if, you know, if Harrison Smith had retired and the Vikings weren't able to sign Cam Bynum, I might be really upset that Justin Reed hadn't signed that deal with the Vikings right now. One of the other ones that I would highlight is Nate Hobbs signing a 4-year, $48 million deal with the Packers. And that's really only $12 million. Hobbs was somebody I shouted out on our free agency preview pod that I did with Nick. And, you know, it was just kind of maybe one of my guys. So maybe I'm a little bit attached to that, but I don't think $12 million is too bad for a starting corner. I think he's got a little bit more, I trust him a little bit more, I would say, than Isaiah Rodgers. And I might have been willing to pay the extra to do that or to get that kind of player that I trust a little bit more. And, you know, I was a little bit disappointed that he went to the Packers in that case. But at the end of the day, like, it's pretty nitpicky for me. These are all pretty nitpicky. It's just ones, you know, where maybe I would have done things a little bit differently. The next one is I might have chosen to sign Bobby Brown, who went from the Rams to, I don't even remember where he went, or Levi Onwuzurike, who went back to the Lions for 1 year, $5.5 million. Bobby Brown got 3 for $21 million. I might have done that instead of Javon Hargrave. I might be miscasting Bobby Brown a little bit, but I liked him a little bit as a penetrating player who can still play well against the run, and was more of a penetrating nose for the Rams, which is, you know, like, kind of is redundant with the Harrison Phillips role. He might not mesh, like, being on the line at the same time with Jonathan Allen as well. But, like, I just thought it was an interesting concept, and I liked the player a lot, and he's only like 24. And Levi Onwuzurike has a hip thing that has kind of turned teams off from him, and why he only got $5 million or $5.5 million, despite me giving him to the Vikings in, like, the mock free agency that he did. For Hargrave, I just think he might be a little over the hill at this point. You know, he's coming off of a major injury. He's a couple years removed from his best pass rushing seasons. I don't know if guys can maintain that level of pass rush without falling off, and he was never a good run defender in the first place. So I'm a little bit concerned with him overall there, but I still like the signing in aggregate, especially alongside Jonathan Allen, right? It's just, I thought there were a couple other lower deals that maybe were also options in that case. And then on the offensive line, you know, I liked Patrick McCarry. I think I would have been willing to do the deal that he got from the Jaguars, which was like 3 for 36, or it might have been 3 for 37.5, something like that. Or James Daniels, who got 3 years for $24 million. He was from the Steelers as a guard. I don't remember where he went. But, you know, do one of those deals instead of the Ryan Kelly deal, get a little bit of a younger player who can be more impactful, and maybe keep Garrett Bradbury, and then move Blake Brandel to like a swing tackle or a swing interior offensive lineman position, you know, would kind of be my thought process there. Obviously, I'm pretty happy with Ryan Kelly, and I'm fine with moving on from Bradbury. I just thought maybe Brandel is a little bit of a weaker point on the offensive line, but obviously the Vikings don't agree with me, right? Or they just viewed Ryan Kelly as a better player than those guys, so that's not too big of a deal. And then the final one I would have done, which is maybe a hindsight, I talked about this a lot in the opening section, is Nick Mullins for 2 years, $6.5 million to be our backup quarterback. It doesn't cost you a comp pick. A lot of these other guys kind of mess with comp pick formula, and that's why I think the Vikings are a little bit frozen on quarterback right now. I don't think it's because they're pursuing some other guy who's out there on the market, who we'll talk about in a second. I think it's really just because they're trying to avoid spending a comp pick on a quarterback, and Nick Mullins would have solved that problem immediately by having previously been on your team and not being that expensive. So a little bit disappointed they weren't able to get that done, but obviously with the Daniel Jones contract being in limbo for a little bit, they weren't necessarily willing to go there. The final thing I wanted to talk about, just because it has people in a tizzy right now in Vikings fandom, is the rumor that I think that is ridiculous, that Aaron Rodgers really the rumor is Aaron Rodgers really wants to play for the Minnesota Vikings, and the Minnesota Vikings haven't told him absolutely not, never in a million years yet. I don't really get what the deal is, right? Because Diana Rossini and Mike Silver from The Athletic are pushing really, really hard that there's a possibility for Aaron Rodgers to go to the Vikings. If you listen to Adam Schefter, he basically laughs it off in a segment that he did. And it's like, no, it's ridiculous. JJ McCarthy is going to be the starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. Ian Rappaport basically shut it down entirely, that he really wasn't going to take it seriously until there was any serious inkling that it might be a possibility. So it really sounds like posturing from Aaron Rodgers' agent, who, Aaron Rodgers is a Bay Area guy. Mike Silver has been a long time Bay Area reporter. I think there's some connection there between Silver and Aaron Rodgers, and they're basically using him as a mouthpiece to try to get the Vikings interested in Rodgers, is kind of what it is. I'm not clear on whether or not Aaron Rodgers' contract with the Jets had offsets, right? But if it didn't, and offset language is basically, so if a player has guaranteed money on their contracts and you cut him, you have to pay him the money that was guaranteed. But offset language says if they sign a deal with another team, and that whatever money that team pays you for the time period, right, that we were supposed to pay you that guaranteed money, we don't owe you anymore. Right. So Russell Wilson signed a minimum contract with the Steelers because his contract with the Broncos had offset language. So anything the Steelers paid him up until, 30 something million dollars was going to just get offset. So Russ was going to earn that money, whether or not they paid him $1 million or they paid him $30 million, he's going to earn the same amount. So it behooved the Steelers to not pay him anything, and it behooved Russ to go to a team that didn't have to pay him $30 million. Right. So Aaron Rodgers was owed $37 million. If his contract had offset language, you would have to pay him $40 million to start, to have him start earning more money than he was going to anyway, right? So no team is going to be in for $40 million on Aaron Rodgers. So if his contract had offset language, he would cost nothing. So the Vikings keeping a bunch of 2025 cap space, which I had somebody ask me about, is not an indication that they're interested in Aaron Rodgers. Also, it's such a stupid idea. It's so unconscionably stupid to bring this guy to the Minnesota Vikings. So I just can't believe that they're in on it at all. And if they do sign him and I have to eat him words, I'm just going to be absolutely beside myself. So that was a little bit of a rant 10, but I really think it's Aaron Rodgers posturing because he sees the Vikings, likes what they're doing, and is like, maybe I could have that for me. Well, Aaron, no, you can't. You suck. Bye. So yeah, I didn't know I was going to get that spicy at the end of it, but that's pretty much all I have for this podcast. So we kind of went over everything in detail. I'll try to get more in-depth tape watches on all these players and kind of descriptions of that, or at least to the big guys, and go over that in future episodes. But until then, my name is Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football on BlueSky. My co-host Nick Olson is at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. We are at Kindred Skulls on both Twitter and BlueSky. We're available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and also available on YouTube. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.